This video is all about energy and how energy is involved in thinking about chemistry. So we talk a lot about energy. It's a word we use in common everyday language. In fact, the United States has a Department of Energy. Sometimes parents might describe their child as being a high energy kid. Sometimes, we might be in some situation involving a lot of drama and we say, oh, I just don't have the emotional energy to cope with that. But in science, we mean something a little bit different when we're talking about energy. So energy is involved in chemical reactions, and it's part of what makes things happen in science. And so energy is needed, in commonplace terms, to heat and cool homes, to power our electronics, to run our cars, and even to fuel our bodies. But energy is really an abstract kind of concept. And so we're going to be talking a lot about energy and hoping to build up an understanding of it. Now, if you ask a physicist what is energy, a physicist will tell you that energy is the capacity to do work. Now, that's not a very helpful definition because you have to know what work is. And work means a very specific kind of thing to a physicist. It doesn't mean just going out and, raking leaves or something like that, which is what we've been doing a lot of around here. Now, work means exerting a force and moving some massive object through a distance. Well, at least that's what work means to a physicist. And so we can think of energy as the capacity to make things happen, to set things in motion. We'll get a better idea of what energy is as we go along. So early on with humankind, our principal source of energy was by burning wood. And we've actually discovered that our ability to make fire, humankind's ability to make fire, goes very, very far back. And this was a real advance for our kind, our species, because now we were able to provide heat, light, it was protection, it meant we could cook our food. The use of coal has also been used since ancient times. There are records that the Romans used it, and other folks throughout, including some North American Indians, used coal as fuel. But it really didn't take off in terms of a primary fuel source until the middle of the 19th century during the Industrial Revolution. Since then, in the 20th century, we discovered petroleum products, so oil, natural gas, these sort of things, used as our primary fuel sources. And even today, we mostly use these fossil fuel petroleum-based products. So here it lists U.S. energy consumption by energy source from 2014. So these are approximate numbers, but you see that of the almost 100 quadrillion BTUs, a quadrillion is 10 raised to the 15 power, and BTU is a British thermal unit, which is the English unit for energy. So you see that here in the U.S. we still use 35% petroleum, 28% natural gas, and 18% coal. And even this little pie piece that's labeled renewable energies, use 50% of that is biomass, and these are also carbon-containing fuel sources. So let's think a little bit about energy that can come from chemical reactions. You'll notice that most of those things that we were burning, those petroleum products, those all involve chemical reactions. There are other kinds of chemical reactions that take place in, say, batteries that produce electrical energy. And even what's going on in photocells might be thought of as kind of a chemical process. So let's look at chemical reactions. So the stuff that we put into our cars to make them go, gasoline, is a mixture of a whole bunch of different kinds of hydrocarbon compounds. One of them is octane, or things related to octane, and in fact, fuel quality of gasoline is compared against this substance called isooctane. And isooctane has a particular structure you can look up. But it has this formula, C8H18. And so when we burn that in our engines, a little bit of gasoline liquid is sprayed into the cylinder in the engine of your car. That is mixed with oxygen, and a little spark ignites that mixture. When that happens, it combusts and gets converted into carbon dioxide and water vapor. Now these two gases, we have more gas molecules at the end than we had to start with. And we know when you have more gas molecules, the pressure increases. We also know that this reaction releases a lot of heat energy, which warms up the mix. And we know that as you warm up gases, the pressure also increases. And it's that buildup in pressure, that explosive buildup in pressure, that pushes a piston out. And that piston then turns some rods, which turns a crankshaft, which turns the wheels of your car and makes your car go. So that release of energy comes ultimately from chemicals. Similarly, in our bodies, we consume foods. Those foods are digested, and the proteins, the fats, the carbohydrates all get converted into other forms, but one of those forms might be this simple sugar glucose. Glucose is then oxidized in our body, combined with oxygen, through a process that looks a lot like combustion, but it occurs through many, many steps, the steps of glycolysis and the Krebs cycle, also known as the citric acid cycle, and the electron transport chain to eventually reduce this glucose to carbon dioxide and water. And when it does, it releases energy that our body can then use to do stuff and power our cells. So it turns out there are two classes of energy. The first class is called kinetic energy, and that is energy of motion. So anything that is in motion has kinetic energy. There's sort of three kinds of motion that we can talk about. Translational motion, which might be the energy of this cannonball after it's shot out of the cannon flying through space. Then there's rotational motion. You might imagine that this object that's down here is spinning around on its axis. And then there's vibrational motion. So you might imagine these two balls connected by a spring getting pulled out and back, so the spring is springing back and forth. So that would be vibrational energy. But they're all types of energy of motion. Physicists have a way of calculating the translational energy of an object moving through space, like this cannonball. And they say that kinetic energy is equal to 1/2 the mass, so we need to know the mass of the cannonball, times its velocity squared. And so velocity, the magnitude of velocity, is just the speed. So how fast is this cannonball coming out? Let's square that, multiply it by the mass of the cannonball, and that will be related to the kinetic energy. So we see that kinetic energy is related to two things: how fast an object is moving and how massive it is. The second class of energy is potential energy. So potential energy is energy due to position. So for example, this rock up here has potential energy. It has the potential to do work, to cause something to be set in motion and happen. And that's because it's at a higher position in Earth's gravitational field. So if we were to release that rock, it would fall to the ground and be at lower gravitational potential energy. Another example, two electric charges. So this positive charge and this negative charge, they are attracted to each other. These little lines are showing you the lines of force, and so they would like to get pulled together. So if we release them from this position, they're going to get pulled towards each other. So that is energy due to position. We could change their position, increase the distance between them, and they would be at a different potential energy. These two balls connected by the spring represent a different kind of potential energy. If I were to stretch the spring out and hold on to both of these balls, then they would be at a different potential energy. They would feel this force that would want to pull them back together. Similarly, I could compress the spring, and they would have a force that would be trying to push them further apart. So there would be this potential to set things in motion. So that's energy due to position, either the position of the atoms in the spring, the position of these particles, or the position of the rock above Earth's surface. So it's interesting that the energy of an object or a system, which might contain many different things, that energy can change. So for example, here my example of the rock, if we drop this rock, right here it has all potential energy. As it begins to fall, it's moving faster and faster. And we know that kinetic energy is related to how fast you're moving. So right here, halfway down, all of the energy that it initially had has been converted into kinetic energy. So we've got half kinetic energy, and it's at a lower position, so its potential energy is now less than it was when it was held in the hands up here. And the instant before it hits the ground down here, all of this potential energy has been converted into kinetic energy. Here's another example. Imagine that we've got a gas in a bottle, and we've got a balloon on top. Now right now these gas molecules are moving kind of slowly, and they're fairly close together. As we start heating this up, we know that heat is going to increase the average kinetic energy of the molecules. So they start moving faster, indicated by these longer lines. As they start moving faster. And as they do that, they expand up into this space, and they move further apart. So the gas is moving faster, so we've increased their kinetic energy, and the molecules are farther apart. When molecules are close together, they tend to have a little bit of an attraction towards themselves. So here we've changed the average distance between the molecules. So we've changed their potential energy as well as their kinetic energy by changing their relative positions to each other. Energy can also be transferred from one thing to another thing, or converted from one form, we might say, into another form. So here in this game of pool, we're shooting this cue ball at these stationary balls. This ball is moving very fast. It hits the racked balls down here, and then the cue ball slows down. Maybe it ricochets a little bit, but then all these other balls pick up the energy. Energy has been transferred from the moving cue ball to all these other balls, and they will begin to move around the table. Probably slower and with less energy than this cue ball, but some of them can move pretty fast. So this cue ball transfers its energy through collisions by bumping into this first ball, which knocks into some other balls, and so on until they go shooting around the table. And hopefully some of them wind up in the pockets. Here's another example of conversion of energy. So in this case, the sun is releasing photons, or radiant energy. Photons, you'll remember, are little particles of light. And we can think of those particles as being little packets of energy. They are the smallest possible packets of energy that light is able to have. And when light hits this photovoltaic cell in a solar panel, it causes in the semiconductor an electron to be promoted to a higher energy level, where that electron is now free to conduct electricity. That electricity can then flow out from the photocell into, say, this light bulb, which then converts the photons energy into electrical energy, and then that electrical energy is converted back into photons inside a room. And then these electrons, as they flow through this light bulb to cause it to light up, they flow back into the semiconductor. So we have a closed loop here. So you see, again, we're transferring energy from the sunlight to the photocell to the light bulb, and we're also converting types. So from radiant energy into electrical energy back into radiant energy. So there's a very important law of nature that folks have figured out by thinking about energy and looking at lots and lots of experiment. And that law is that energy is conserved. And so what that means is that the total energy of everything before some process takes place has to equal the total energy of everything after the process is done. Another way of saying that is that energy can neither be created nor destroyed. So this is a law of nature, what's called the first law of thermodynamics. And laws are things that are generalizations of lots and lots of observations of many different kinds of experiments under a wide range of circumstances. So it has a wide range of applicability. So we're going to call it a law. But again, it's just a summary of observations. Why does this law exist in our universe? Well, we don't know. It just is. A law is nature's way of saying, that's just the way it is. So what is this thermodynamics term that I introduced? Well, thermodynamics is a particular area of study. In fact, it's a branch of physics, and it's that branch of physics that studies things like energy, heat, and work. So we're chemists, and we're going to be interested in thinking about energy and how it relates to chemical changes. We've already seen that a lot of the things that we use to produce energy in our society result from burning chemicals, right? From chemical reactions. So it turns out that energy changes that occur during a chemical reaction are due primarily to the making and breaking of chemical bonds. So the energy, the amount of energy, is then related to the strength of those bonds. So the amount that gets released or absorbed will depend on the strengths of the bonds that are made or broken. So let's look at a specific example. So here are two different compounds, dimethyl ether and ethyl alcohol. So these are the Lewis structures for dimethyl ether and ethyl alcohol down here. Ethyl alcohol is sometimes called ethanol or grain alcohol, and it's the kind of alcohol that are in adult beverages. So both of these molecules are formed from exactly the same number and type of atoms. So we need 2 carbon atoms, 6 hydrogen atoms, and 8 oxygen atoms. So let's imagine that we had those atoms in the gas phase. These atoms are far apart from each other, so they're not going to bind together to form molecules. And we mix them and we sort of force them to arrange themselves in this way. So if this chemical reaction happens, it turns out that we will release energy. So I'll draw a little arrow of stuff coming out here. We will release 3,151 kilojoules of energy. This symbol J here, that's the symbol for joule, which is our SI unit for the amount of energy. So let's look at dimethyl ether and count the kinds of bonds that we have. So you'll see that we have 6 carbon to hydrogen single bonds. We also have 2 carbon to oxygen single bonds, and they are right there and there, right? So now let's do the same thing. Let's take these same atoms, 2 carbons, 6 hydrogens, and 1 oxygen atom in the gas phase, separated from each other, and combine them in a different way to make ethyl alcohol. So we're going to bond them together in a different way. That again is going to release some energy, and it releases 3,204 kilojoules of energy when we do that. So you'll notice that the amount of energy that we release is different. Let's see what else is different. Let's count the bonds again. So in ethanol we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 carbon to hydrogen single bonds. We have 1 carbon to carbon single bond. We have 1 carbon to oxygen single bond. And we have 1 oxygen to hydrogen single bond. So you'll notice that if we add these up, in each case we have 8 bonds. Each case we have 8 bonds for ethyl alcohol and also for dimethyl ether. So even though we have the same number of bonds, we have different types of bonds. So why does one release more energy than the other? Well, it must be that these bond strengths are different. As it turns out, and I've kind of written over the space here, energy is always released when chemical bonds are formed. And so we must release more energy when we form stronger bonds. So it must be that this particular arrangement of bonds is stronger than the particular arrangement of bonds that we have in dimethyl ether. Let's look at another example that's more practical using these same chemicals. So what we're going to do is we're going to burn these 2 substances. So we're going to look at combustion reactions for these 2 substances. So we see if we take dimethyl ether, so that's the first formula that we have right here. This is dimethyl ether. So we take dimethyl ether, CH3 with an O in between and another CH3 group on the other side. And we're going to combust it, so that means to react with oxygen. And the products, when you combust a compound that contains just carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen, you make carbon dioxide and water. 2 moles of CO2 and 3 moles of H2O. And when we do that, we're going to release 1,327 kilojoules of energy. If we combust ethanol with oxygen to make the same 2 moles of carbon dioxide and same 3 moles of water, we will release, when we burn 1 mole of ethanol, 1,275 kilojoules being released. So we release less energy when we burn ethanol than we do when we burn dimethyl ether. So we can conclude that it's going to take more energy to break the bonds in ethanol than in dimethyl ether. So if we think about these chemical reactions, what's going on? We've got to break some bonds in the reactants, and we've got to make bonds in the products. So we've got making and breaking of bonds going on. So we've got to put in energy to break the bonds, right? And we're going to release energy when bonds are made. But both these reactions, we're making the same number and type of bonds in the products. So what must be different then is the amount of energy that is required to break these bonds. And as a little note, energy is always required as an input in order to break chemical bonds.